Good evening, and welcome to Sleepless Historian. You're in a quiet place now, made for slow stories, soft thoughts, and peaceful sleep. Turn down the lights, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let the day gently fade away. Tonight, we'll explore the quieter side of history, simple lives, strange old customs, and forgotten moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. If this calm journey brings you peace or helps you rest, feel free to like or subscribe, only if it feels right. Now, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Privy Council, how kings went to the bathroom, the throne, behind the throne. You've seen thrones. Majestic, carved gold-gilded chairs perched atop dais steps and draped in silk. But tonight, you'll learn about a different kind of throne, the one no royal wanted to be seen upon, and yet none could do without. The garter robe, the close stool, the humble hole in a board. Yes, this story begins not in a grand hall, but in a dark stone chamber, echoing with silence and something else. Let's start in 14th century England. The air in the castle is damp and fragrant with torch smoke. If you listen closely, you might hear the trickle of water below. That's the cesspit, gently burbling, collecting the waste of kings and servants alike. The royalness, all their splendor, medieval castles were often designed around a practical truth. Humans, no matter how noble, must relieve themselves. But for royalty, even this simple act was draped in ritual. Most castles had some form of a garderobe, a small, enclosed chamber with a wooden bench and a round opening carved into it. Beneath that hole, gravity, perhaps a vertical shaft leading to a cesspit below, or to the open air outside, ideally over a flowing river or the castle moat. And in the event that such an outlet wasn't available, buckets, which servants would discreetly and promptly remove. Some garderobes were basic: a slab of wood, a cool draft, a faint echo. Others were more refined. At Dover Castle, the royal privy was lined with stone, and its outlet carefully directed waist down, a vertical shaft that opened onto the cliff's edge, carried far away from sensitive noses. Royal architects became increasingly clever at making the disgusting dignified. The close stool, portable privilege now. Not all royal waste was dropped from dizzying castle heights in courtly chambers and tented pavilions. Monarchs often relied on something far more intimate: the close stool. Imagine a cushioned, wooden chair with a hidden chamber pot tucked beneath a hinged lid. It looked just like furniture until you lifted the seat. These stools were lined with cloth or waxed leather to reduce odor. They were portable, comfortable, and attended to by a servant of singular trust, because kings and queens rarely toileted alone. And that brings us to one of the strangest and most powerful roles in the royal household. Enter the groom. Of the Stooleus, the name is real. The groom of the stool originally in England was tasked with assisting the monarch in matters of excretion. But this wasn't lowly work. Far from it, because in the medieval worldview, attending to a king's most vulnerable moments required absolute discretion, loyalty, and intimacy. The groom would hand the monarch the water bowl for washing. He would ensure the linen cloth was warmed. He might even assist in wiping, though that is debated by historians. What's certain is this: the groom of the stool was often closer to the king than any noble or advisor. He knew the king's daily schedule down to the bowel. He heard things: secrets, complaints, curses. The groom was, in essence, part valet, part physician, part counselor. By the time of Henry VIII, the groom of the stool wielded serious political influence. Letters record nobles begging the groom to whisper requests into the king's ear while seated. Because where there's a throne, there's always politics. Wiping, washing, and the royal bottom. But what did they wipe with? The answer depends on region and century. In early medieval Europe, moss, hay, and cloth rags were common. For royalty, soft linen was preferred, sometimes perfumed. In particularly wealthy households, the cloths were embroidered, dedicated solely to this purpose, and burned after use. Washing was also a part of the routine. Small ceramic basins of water and scented oils were kept near close stools. In Eastern courts, such as the Abbasid Caliphate or Tang China, washing with water was the norm, often involving attendants trained specifically in hygienic rituals. Cleanliness had spiritual significance, especially in Islamic and East Asian royal courts. In the West, where water was viewed with suspicion, dry wiping remained more common, but royalty still sought pleasant scents. Lavender sachets were tucked into robes. Rosewater was sprinkled on cloth. In the French court, it was said that Louis IX would cleanse his hands and nostrils with orange flower water after every visit to his private chamber. Architecture of Odessif. You walk through a medieval castle today. You might find narrow slits in the stone wall, vertical shafts, sometimes mistaken for arrow loops. But these are garderobe chutes. Castle designers placed these openings over flowing water whenever possible. In cold climates, they sometimes ran along the exterior wall to keep smells out of the main chambers. Some garderobes had twin seats, side by side, communal royalty in a way in monasteries, where dozens of monks used the same facilities. Long rows of stone seats, each with its own channel, were carved into latrine buildings, known as reread or ters. But in royal chambers, things were quieter, more private, and more perfumed. Some garderobes even had stone seats carved with decorative symbols. The remains of one English latrine from the 13th century feature an elegant catafoil design around the waist. Whole because even defecation could be artful. Candles were often kept lit inside, not only for light, but to mask smell and rushes. On the floor absorbed both sound and spillage. Still, no amount of rosewater or artistry could eliminate the truth. Medieval castles stank. Toilets on the move. What about when the king traveled? Just like any member of court, the monarch had a traveling close stool. These were often ornately carved, lined with soft leather, and carried by trusted servants. In military campaigns or royal progresses, these stools were part of the royal baggage. The waist was quietly emptied by the groom or his assistants, often in secluded places. In one account from the 15th century, a royal caravan halted for nearly an hour so the king's stool could be discreetly emptied and washed in a nearby stream. These private moments were carefully protected. Tents were drawn. Guards stood by. The king's digestion was, after all, a matter of state. And yet, the logistics of travel sometimes made things awkward. Letters survive complaining of delays due to the unsuitability of the royal enclosure. For relief, especially during winter campaigns, in some cases, stone latrines were hastily built in camp, lined with cloth and scented herbs. The royal bottom had its preferences, even in war, as you can see. Behind every crown there is a chamber. Behind every throne, a seat. And even the most powerful kings and queens in history had to pause each day, to sit, to sigh, and to surrender briefly to the body's humble needs. But what happened when those bodily functions didn't cooperate? When illness, laxatives, or royal diet created more than the groom bargained for? That we'll explore next. Regal remedies, diet disasters, and medicinal bowel movements, asterisk. Let's return now to the hush of stone corridors, the soft slosh of chamber pots, and the world where monarchs fretted not only about diplomacy and conquest, but also about digestion. Behind heavy doors and embroidered curtains, kings and queens of the medieval world quietly struggled with the same deeply human problems: constipation, indigestion, diarrhea, bloating. But unlike commoners, their bodily woes were recorded, treated, and sometimes even politicized. Let's sit quietly, just outside those royal chambers, and listen to the clink of apothecary bottles, the muttered Latin of physicians, and the slow wheezing sighs of monarchs, bound or unbound by the contents of their bowels. When kings couldn't go, royal constipation and herbal cures. Constipation was a chronic concern for medieval nobility. Rich diets, a lack of roughage, and sedentary lifestyles conspired to slow royal intestines. Meat-heavy meals, thick wines, refined breads, and pastries clogged the system with predictable effect. The remedies, they were vast and often aromatic. Medieval physicians, guided by the humoral theory of medicine, believed the body consisted of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A constipated monarch was, therefore, suffering from an imbalance often of cold and dry humors, calling for warm and moist remedies. Enter the laxative. One popular formula involved cassia, senna, and prunes steeped in hot wine, sweetened with honey, and taken at dawn. Another involved warm sheep's milk infused with crushed aniseed and cumin. These were gentle remedies, designed to coax the bowels. If those failed, stronger measures were taken. In the court of King Charles V of France, records describe a potent royal purge involving syrup of roses, fennel extract, and powdered rhubarb root. These were brewed overnight and taken with prayer. Herbalists maintained handwritten herbals, lushly illustrated books, describing the uses and dosages of every plant. Royal apothecaries kept neat jars of aloe, manna, ash, and dried figs, labeled with looped Latin script. But not all purgatives were pleasant. Some nobles resorted to boiled leeches applied to the belly or enemas of warm olive oil. Others tried foul-smelling infusions of ox bile and vinegar. The goal was not just relief, but balance or return to humoral harmony. And when the king finally relieved himself, a page would sometimes be sent to the court physician, carrying a small ceramic vessel. The stool was examined, its color, odor, texture carefully noted. Such was the intimacy of medieval medicine, the enema ritual. From cloister to courtiff, the idea of an enema seems modern. Let us travel back to the 13th century court of Castile. Queen Berenguela, an aging matriarch suffering from chronic pain and constipation, is attended by 2 women and a court physician. She lies on her side. A warm linen cloth is placed beneath her. A silver enema syringe, filled with chamomile tea and warmed goat's milk, is gently inserted. It's not a rushed procedure. The room is silent. Outside, guards keep anyone from entering. In monasteries, enemas were more routine. Cloistered monks, governed by strict dietary rules, frequently suffered digestive issues. Monastic infirmaries often administered enemas with elaborate syringes, long wooden tubes with carved mouthpieces. These were inserted gently and flushed with herbal water, oils, or broth. Royal physicians adopted these methods. King James IV of Scotland, fascinated by anatomy and surgery, kept a royal enema set made of brass and leather. His household medical accounts list clister preparations weekly, including wormwood and marjoram steeped in ale. Enemas were both remedy and ritual. They were often done at dawn, before morning prayers. Some monarchs received them every few days as preventive care. Others, particularly when traveling, avoided them, preferring to remain bound rather than risk an unfortunate episode on the road. Imagine the scene: a servant softly knocking at the royal bedchamber door before sunrise, the apothecary behind him carrying a steaming pot, and a king blinking away sleep, preparing to submit to one of the most intimate treatments in medicine. Royal diets, the root of the problem. To understand royal bowel troubles, we must also understand what they ate. Meals were often grand, excessive, and nutritionally disastrous. A typical medieval royal dinner in France or England might include boiled beef, roasted swan, or spiced rabbit, thick white bread, sifted to remove the bran, creamy sauces made with egg yolks, almonds and vinegar, dried fruit and candied citrus peel, claret wine, often mixed with honey, herbs, or rosewater vegetables, were seen as food for the poor, windy, and dangerous. They were believed to produce gas and melancholy. Leafy greens were rarely served in royal halls. Instead, digestion was aided with digestive spiced wine, aniseed biscuits, or candied ginger. But still, bloating was common. So was heartburn, and the lack of fiber meant constipation plagued even the healthiest kings. One chronicler notes that King Edward IV of England did suffer bloated belly and no wind, and grew wrathful therewith. In other words, gas made him grumpy. As kings aged, their bowels slowed further. Royal physicians prescribed opening foods like figs soaked in vinegar, or boiled lettuce served with olive oil. But often, relief required medicinal intervention. Fragrant oils and bottom bombs delicate ointments were part of the royal toiletry kit. After each movement, especially during illness, perfumed bombs were applied to soothe the skin. These were made by court alchemists and apothecaries using beeswax, rose oil, lavender, and even powdered pearls, yes, pearls, crushed and steeped in almond milk, thought to purify the skin and reduce redness of the font. In Muslim courts such as the Abbasid, Caliphate, or Moorish Spain, sandalwood oil, musk, and camphor were more commonly used. The emphasis was on cleanliness and fragrance in accordance with Islamic hygiene principles. Royal households often kept a special servant known as the Uwaru, who prepared basins of water, clean cloths, and aromatic oils for post-defecation cleansing. Some monarchs insisted on heated cloths. Others preferred sponges soaked in herbal water, then wrung out fresh. Comfort was paramount. The royal bottom could not be chafed. Diarrhea and dysentery, when things went too far, of course. Not all bowel issues were slow-moving. Dysentery was the plague of medieval armies and courts. Poor food storage, contaminated water, and unhygienic kitchens meant royal feasts sometimes resulted in outbreaks of what was then called the flux. Henry V of England died not in battle, but likely from dysentery in 1422 during a campaign in France. His soldiers suffered too, crouching behind tents and palisades, losing fluids by the hour. Treatments were as uncomfortable as the illness. Arrowroot powder mixed with wine, crushed opium to slow the bowels, wine boiled with cloves, cinnamon, and sugar-cold compresses of mint water on the belly in royal courts. Vomiting and purging were seen as signs of the body rejecting imbalance. But when the illness persisted, fear took hold. Servants would inspect chamber pots, looking for blood or mucus. Physicians held the contents to the light. Herbal decoctions were brewed by the hour. And sometimes, even astrologers were consulted. Because if the king's bows failed, the kingdom could too. Royal poop diaries and written records, yes, they existed. Medieval chroniclers and royal physicians kept extensive records. Bowel movements were part of the daily health notes. In 1351, a court doctor recorded that the King of Navarre had not passed stool in 4 days, and grew red in the face when he laughed. French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria's physician noted she voided with difficulty and foul smell in the winter of 1395, following a rich feast of goose and clotted cream. These details, shocking to modern readers, were considered vital signs. Even popes were not spared such scrutiny. The Vatican archives hold physician notes for Pope John the 21st, whose chronic constipation was said to cause visions and fits of judgment. And so, the royal body regal, robed and revered, was also a medical object, poked, prodded, and very closely observed. Bodily humor in court cultured, despite the seriousness of digestive health. The royal court was not above scatological humor. Jesters made subtle jokes about the king's thunder, or mocked noblemen who walked strangely after a purge. Records of banquet entertainment include comic songs about constipation, farts, and chamber pots. In the court of Charles IV of Bohemia, a popular farce involved a noble who mistook his close stool for a treasure chest. Even literature joined in. Chaucer's The Miller's Tale and The Summoner's Tale made crude bathroom jokes aimed squarely at clerics and courtiers alike. In this way, the royal bowel became not only a medical focus, but a source of whispered amusement. And so we pause here, with apothecaries folding up parchment, servants stoking fires beneath herbal pots, and kings sitting gingerly upon embroidered stools, wondering if the potion will work, because even at the height of medieval power, relief was never guaranteed. Each meal, each gulp of wine, each fig and fennel seed carried risk. A slip of spice could bring down a monarch if, not to death, then at least to discomfort. And that discomfort, it was not just personal. It could delay councils, halt travel, or sour treaties. In the end, the medieval court knew, a peaceful kingdom begins with a peaceful stomach. Ceremonial cleanliness, sacred secrecy, and the politics of bodily control, asterisk now. We ease back into the quiet corridors of castle life. The torches flicker, tapestries rustle in the draught. Somewhere behind carved oak doors, a monarch readies for the morning, a ritual involving not robes and crowns, but warm cloths, perfumed oils, and discreet servants. This final section explores the deeper meanings behind royal hygiene and elimination, because for the kings and queens of the medieval world, relieving oneself was never just a private act. It was layered with power, spirituality, and symbolism. Let's move slowly now through royal ablutions, the politics of proximity, sacred privacy, and the strange role the body played in affirming sovereignty, rituals of mourning, cleanliness. Understand the deeper implications of royal toileting, we must begin with the morning. Most medieval courts followed a strict routine upon waking. The king or queen would be roused by trusted attendants. The room was warmed, the shutters slightly parted, fresh garments were laid out, and beside the bed waited the ewerer, the groom of the stool, and sometimes a physician. The monarch began the day not with conversation or state matters, but with bodily maintenance. A basin of warmed water was brought forward, often scented. with lemon balm, rose, or vinegar. Hands and face were washed first. Then the privy matters. Some rulers insisted on being alone for this part of the day. Others allowed a single attendant. In either case, the moment was hushed, sacred, and steeped in habit. One document from the Burgundian court describes Duke Philip the Good receiving lavender-infused cloths before each bowel movement. The cloth was held gently against the skin, not wiped, but patted, as the Duke meditated in silence. The act of defecation, so common, became ritualized, guarded, and solemn. Privacy as power, guarded bodies and hidden stools. Physical privacy of a monarch was a matter of politics. In early medieval courts, kings often lived communally with their nobles, eating and sleeping in the great hall. But as royal authority consolidated, so did architectural privacy. The royal chambre emerged an inner sanctum, inaccessible to all but the most trusted. Within it stood not just the royal bed, but also the close stool, the washstand, and sometimes a curtained enclosure for relieving oneself. The fewer who witnessed the monarch's bodily functions, the more mysterious and powerful that body became by the 14th century. French and English courts carefully regulated who could enter the bedchamber and when. Groom of the stool appointments were scrutinized by nobles, as they offered unparalleled access to the king's most vulnerable moments. In the court of Henry VII, the groom of the stool held keys not only to the king's stool, but to his secrets, moods, and even finances. Household records show that grooms were tasked with noting the king's appetite, bowel habits, an emotional state relayed discreetly to counselors. It was a reminder: control over the king's body meant influence over the crown. And so, chamber pots were not merely containers of waste. They were containers of privilege, the symbolism of royal bodies to the medieval mind. The king's body was not simply human, it was symbolic. Political theorists spoke of the two bodies. Of the king, the body natural, which aged, ached, and eventually died, and the body politic, which was eternal, unblemished, and sacred. But when a king fell ill, when he vomited, sweated, or could not move his bowels, this illusion cracked. Therefore, every effort was made to protect the public image of royal health. One chronicler writes that King Louis XI of France suffered from severe dyspepsia, but no courtiers were permitted to discuss it. His groom of the stool kept false entries in the daily health log, showing vigorous movements to discourage court gossip. In a world where divine right ruled, an unhealthy king raised dangerous questions. Was he cursed? Was his reign out of harmony with the cosmos? Was it time for change? Thus, bodily control became political control. Royal physicians used astrology, prayer, and purges to preserve appearances. Queens were wrapped in fragrant linen during their courses. Kings were carried to battle even when unwell. To avoid suspicion, the royal body had to appear not just functional but godlike. Hygiene and holiness, spiritual dimensions of elimination in many cultures. Cleanliness had spiritual weight. In Islamic courts, where ablution was part of daily worship, caliphs observed strict hygiene routines. Special servants brought silver basins, sandalwood-scented soaps, and ritual cloths. The private bathhouse was both cleansing and sacred. In Hindu kingdoms, such as the Chola Empire of South India, rulers followed ritual purification before entering temples or participating in courtly rites. This included defecation in prescribed locations, followed by a full body wash. In Christian Europe, the emphasis was more symbolic. Washing hands before Mass, or feet on Maundy Thursday was an act of humility and grace. But beyond these rites, bodily functions were often viewed with suspicion as shameful or signs of fallen flesh. Nevertheless, monastic orders developed detailed codes for hygiene. Benedictine monks maintained shared latrines, rotated cleaning duties, and bathed at set intervals. Some abbots built elaborate plumbing systems, with gravity-fed water to rinse waste channels, precursors to modern sanitation. Royal chapels, too, were not immune to the scent of bodies. Some kings refused to pray unless freshly cleaned. Others, like Charlemagne, were said to keep bathing robes near the altar should divine inspiration strike during a soak. The body, in all its humbling glory, was in constant dialogue with the soul. Etiquette manuals and bathroom behavior, what was the proper way to go when you were born to rule. Surviving etiquette books from the late Middle Ages provide curious insight. The Book of the Civilized Man, France, c. 1380, advised noble children, when thou wouldst relieve thy belly, do not call aloud nor curse the gods. Instead, cough lightly, or hum a tune. Another guide from the Spanish court warned, do not examine thy leavings in public. Speak not of wind or smell. If thou must pass wind, do so in private, or amidst a crowd, so it may be doubted. These small rules served a larger purpose, maintaining decorum in a world always watching. For even at their most vulnerable, royals were expected to uphold dignity. Court poets turned bodily references into metaphor. The night garden became code for the privy chamber. The perfume of decisions was a jest about royal flatulence. The best jokes were whispered, royal toilets as gifts and symbols. Incredibly, royal lavatories were sometimes given as gifts. Emperors of China's Song dynasty bestowed gilded chamber pots crafted from jade or lacquered wood on foreign dignitaries. These were not practical items, but symbols of status and cleanliness. In Ottoman courts, elaborate Totsuyakane toilet pavilions were built for favored concubines, adorned with tilework and fountains. Queen Elizabeth I of England was gifted silver-plated close stool with velvet upholstery, hand-delivered by a noble family seeking favor. She reportedly used it for over a decade. Even in gift-giving, toileting had meaning. To provide a lavatory was to offer protection, privacy, and dignity. It was a mark of intimacy between giver and ruler. Hidden infrastructure, toilets as architecture by the 15th century. Royal castles and palaces had entire architectural wings devoted to hygiene. The Tower of London included vertical shafts for waste, shielded by angled masonry to prevent splash. Windsor Castle's great garderobe had 5 stalls, each connected to chutes descending over the outer moat. In Islamic Spain, Alhambra's royal palace included heated bathhouses, flushable toilets, and marble basins. Waste was swept through clay pipes into underground channels, a level of sanitation not matched in Western Europe for centuries. Medieval Japan's imperial palaces used wooden chutes directed into walled garden areas where attendants collected waste daily. This was later used as fertilizer, closed-loop economy, centuries ahead of its time. Every royal court had its own system, but all were designed with the same goal, to protect the monarch from the sight, sound, and smell of their own humanity. The more invisible the process, the more invincible the ruler. Last thoughts from the royal chamber, we bring this story to a quiet close. Picture again the scene. A flickering candle, the soft creak of a wooden stool lid, a servant waiting, not looking, a bowl of warm water, a linen cloth folded just so, a sovereign sighing, at last, in relief. In these private moments, monarchs were no different from their subjects, hungry, weak in pain, embarrassed, and yet around them swirled ceremony, architecture, fragrance, and power designed to veil the rawness of need in velvet and incense. The toilet, in medieval courts, was not simply a place of elimination. It was a site of trust, a test of loyalty, a measure of ritual, and it reminds us, with peculiar tenderness, that no matter how exalted their titles, even the greatest rulers in history had to go. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. A new corner of forgotten history awaits. Story 2: Royal Itch, Fleas, Lice, and the golden combs of medieval queens, of combs and crawlers, the constant companions of courtly hair, asterisk, and now. Let's drift into a new corner of forgotten history. A quieter place, yet no less curious. Imagine yourself beneath heavy drapes, velvet pressing softly around your ears. Outside, a courtyard hums with distant bells and hoofbeats, but inside, there is only the quiet scratch of comb through hair, and the flick of a flea cast into the fire. Because, for the queens and princesses of the medieval world, life was rarely without adornment or itching. Let us begin our slow descent into this. Regal discomfort, a crowning glory, hair as heritage in medieval courts across the world. A noblewoman's hair was no mere fashion. It was lineage, status, even holiness. Queens had hair that was washed in scented infusions and combed with ivory. Locks were braided with gold thread, dusted with powders, or veiled in translucent silks. Poets compared them to rivers, to wheat, fields, to night. But beneath those glowing metaphors, there was reality. Hair was rarely cut, rarely washed, and often teeming with life. Indeed, one chronicler of the Carolingian court noted that Queen Hildegard's golden hair reached her waistband required 3 ladies and a basin of wine to cleanse. Long hair was sacred, symbolic, and, unfortunately, a haven for vermin. Lice and fleas nestled in the warm scalp. Nits clung to shafts like seeds on barley. Itching was constant. Comb sessions took hours, and yet no queen would dream of shaving her head. It would be like stripping herself of royal grace. The golden comb, the medieval royal comb, was not just a toolet, was a symbol of elegance and necessity, crafted from ivory, horn, silver, or even gold. These combs were often double-sided, one edge with wide teeth for deep, the other with fine, tightly packed prongs for removing lice and nits. Some were decorated with saints, others bore floral patterns. A few, like those of Byzantine empresses, were set with tiny pearls or sapphires. These combs lived in silk pouches, beside perfumes and prayer beads. They were brought out daily, sometimes twice daily, for long sessions of grooming. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine's household records list 2 golden combs for the queen's head, and 6 attendants to dress her hair. 6. The act of combing was both a chore and a performance. Attendants sat cross-legged behind the queen. A bowl of water, often infused with rosemary or mint, rested nearby. As the comb passed through the strands, they would murmur gossip. Today, her grace has fewer nits, one might whisper, a sign of favor. Another would flick a squirming flea into the hearth, where it popped faintly like a seed. Lice and fleas, court intruders where there were humans, there were lice, the pediculus humanus, capitis, or head louse, was a constant in medieval life. It moved from hair to hair easily, especially in the close quarters of a court. Fleas, meanwhile, came with furs, velvet cloaks, ermine linings, wolf pelt capsule, beautiful, all infested. The flea's flat body made it ideal for hiding in seams and hems, its jump, long enough to cross from queen to lady-in-waiting, during a shared curtsy. But these parasites were not just annoying, they carried meaning. A clean scalp, free of lice, was a sign of God's favor. Infestation could suggest moral impurity or even sorcery. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria reportedly blamed a court rival for sending creeping spirits that brought her scalp to ruin. Remedies abounded. Crushed garlic paste, applied to the scalp with unfortunate side effects, wine rinses, infused with rose petals and powdered sage ashes of lavender, rubbed into the parting live frogs, held against the scalp to draw out the heat. Yes, really, some queens simply endured. Others made the grooming ritual part of court life. In the court of Catherine de Medici, mornings began not with state business, but with flea catching, the flea comb and the hearth fleas. Dislike fire. This basic truth gave rise to one of the more curious royal practices, the flea-burning bowl. During grooming, noble women kept a small brass bowl by the hearth. Any louse or flea pulled from the comb was dropped in, often with a sizzle. Some bowls were filled with oil, others had coals. Attendants prided themselves on their accuracy, flicking parasites into the flames with swift grace. One record from the Polish court describes a contest among ladies-in-waiting to see who could deliver the most lively fleas to the flame. There was laughter, even applause. These odd rituals provided structure to court life. Quiet moments where intimacy bloomed not just between queens and their attendants, but between women who shared the same discomforts, the same hyrex, the same search for grace in an itchy world. Washing hair, rare and ritualized. Washing was not common. In medieval Europe, it was believed that too much moisture weakened the scalp. Wetting the head, some physicians warned, could invite phlegmatic humors and lead to melancholy. And so, queens often went weeks, sometimes months without a true wash. Instead, they turned to dry cleaning. Powders made from iris root, and rice flour dustings of crushed rose petals, and chalk rubbings with linen soaked in rosemary water when actual washing occurred. It was ceremonial. Queen Elizabeth of Hungary is said to have washed her hair only on feast days, using rainwater collected from silver bowls. In Islamic courts, washing was more frequent, especially among royal women who followed purification rites. Baths of henna and jasmine were common, and combs were stored in sandalwood chests in Japan's Heian period. Noble women grew hair to floor length and washed it with rice-bran water once every few days. Attendants dried it with silk fans and pressed it with wooden boards to maintain shine. Every culture had its own rhythm, but always the goal was the same: to make hair both beautiful and bearable. Lice as entertainment. The strange games of royal courts. You may find this peculiar, but lice and fleas were not just nuisances. In some courts, they were amusement. In the 12th century Norman court, a traveling bard records that Queen Matilda's ladies kept a flea box of chased ivory for holding their catchings. They would boast about who had captured the largest, the fattest, the fastest. Some collected the bugs on pins, arranging them in patterns. Others named them. A flea found on the king's sleeve. It might be called Little Louis, a particularly stubborn nit, Lady Grapin. While this sounds absurd, it speaks to the sheer normalcy of infestation. Rather than despair, courts turned discomfort into ritual, and ritual into bonding. Even boredom could be conquered one flea at a time. Let's pause here, shall we? Set aside the golden comb. Let the scent of rosewater linger in the air. Somewhere, a little flea has evaded the fire, but for now, the queen rests, her head still cradled in the lap of a gentle hand. Because beneath the crown, behind the veils, there was always a scalp form, living and just as vulnerable as yours. Veils, vermin, and the silent labor of courtly hair returned to the chamberlet. The chamber doors close softly behind you. The room is dim now, lit only by a flickering oil lamp and the red glow of embers. You sit again beside a royal dressing stool, surrounded by thick tapestries and the faint scent of dried herbs. And once more the scratching begins not of pens on parchment, but of comb on scalp, slow, rhythmic, familiar. Let's drift deeper into the lives of the women who wore the veil, bore the itch, and turned discomfort into courtly ritual. Layers upon layers, the weight of hair and the veils above it. Medieval queens did not simply have hair. They carried it, adorned it, displayed it, and covered it. Depending on region and faith, a queen's hair might be braided into ropes and looped over the ears, rolled into buns beneath a linen coif, or pinned under a translucent veil. Some styles required wire cages. Others used beeswax to mold the locks into position. Veils, for many royal women, were not optional. In Christian courts, a married queen was expected to keep her hair veiled in publica, symbol of piety and humility. In Islamic caliphates, elaborate head coverings signified modesty, but also privilege. The finest silks were reserved for royal households, but beneath those layers, sweat, oil, powder, lice. One servant of Queen Margaret of Scotland described the daily removal of her veil like lifting a fogged window, the air beneath warm and close. Her combs came away slick, sometimes crawling. Still, she smiled. It was expected, because beauty was discipline, even when it itched. The silent labor, women behind the crown, behind every regal head. There were hands steady, skilled, and often unseen. Courtly hair care was the domain of attendants, usually women from noble but lower-ranking families. They began their service in adolescence, learning the intricacies of braidwork, oil blending, and most crucially lice removal. The best were known not just for their touch, but for their silence. A good hairdresser did not flinch at what she found in the scalp. She did not gossip about scabs, flakes, or sore spots. She knew which oils calmed which humors, and how to soothe the queen's mood as surely as her crown. Their tools included fine-tooth bone combs, sanded smooth hair hooks for braiding, linen cloths for wiping lice, and dandruff, small knives for scraping stubborn knits. They often worked seated on stools, with the queen's hair draped over their lap like tapestry. Sessions could last hours, and each movement entangling, oiling, pinning was done with reverence. Some queens formed close bonds with their hairdressers. Letters survive from Empress Theophanu of the Holy Roman Empire, praising her dear woman of the comb who restores not only my scalp, but my spirits. Others were more demanding. Queen Juana of Castile reportedly dismissed 3 attendants in 1 week for pulling too hard. Potions and pastes, the apothecary's contribution. When natural remedies failed, queens turned to apothecaries. These learned. Men, and occasionally women, maintained a stock of oils, powders, and bombs tailored to royal scalps. Common ingredients included quassia wood, steeped in vinegar to drive out lice, cypress oil, used to mask the smell of scalp infections, sulfur paste, spread behind the ears, though foul-smelling hellebore powder, blown onto the roots to suffocate insects. The more potent recipes were handled with caution. A misstep could cause rashes or worse. One court record from Naples in the 13th century notes a queen who developed severe burns after a mercury-based lice treatment, and still the quest for relief continued. Some queens imported treatments from afar. Queen Tamar of Georgia, reportedly, had a Persian preparation sent monthly a salve of crushed camphor and clove, stirred in honey and applied before bed. Apothecaries delivered their concoctions in glass phials wrapped in wool. Hairdressers applied them with soft brushes, and the queen, eyes closed, would exhale slowly, just hoping the itching might stop. Hair at night, sleep, scratching, and sleeveless gowns in sleep. The royal scalp offered no peace. Queens wore loose nightgowns with open seams to avoid overheating. Hair was either unbound and spread across the pillow or braided, loosely and wrapped in linen. But lice were nocturnal. Many queens scratched in their sleep. Some records even describe bedding stained with blood from nightly itching. To combat this, hairdressers sometimes sprinkled mint powder onto pillows or stitched lavender sachets into pillowcas. In Scandinavian courts, where fur-lined bedding was common, fleas nested in mattresses. Beds were shaken every morning. Servants used birch brooms to beat the bedding, dislodging vermin. Still, infestations persisted. One servant to Queen Jadwiga of Poland wrote in her journal, "The queen sleeps not. Her hands seek her neck again and again. I oil the sheets, but to little end." Occasionally, the entire royal bedchamber would be fumigated, sealed, and filled with smoke from burning herbs. Everyone fled the room, even the lice, until next week, when they returned. Flea traps and linen tricks. The royal wardrobe also fought the battle. Lice lived not only on hair, but in clothing, especially seams, collars, and underlinings. To outwit them, tailors devised clever traps, white linen, bands tied around the scalp under veils. Lice would congregate there, making them easier to remove. Embroidered flea catchers, small loops sewn into collars and cuffs where vermin could be plucked. Fur sachets lined with dried lemon peels and camphor worn beneath gowns. These hidden defenses were sewn with care. A queen's undergarments were often more hygienically valuable than her outer robes. In some courts, queens changed underlayers twice daily. Attendants washed them in lye soap, boiled them in copper cauldrons, and beat them dry with paddles. Cleanliness was labor-intensive, and all of it hidden. When a queen appeared in public serene, composed, gliding in brocade, one saw the flea catcher stitched into her hem, or the chalk dust on her nape, or the scratch she barely suppressed. Beauty, as always, required quiet effort. Religious rituals and hair modesty for many queens, especially in Orthodox, Islamic, and early Christian courts, hair held not only aesthetic but religious meaning. In Byzantium, a queen's hair was often consecrated at marriage. Veiling was both modesty and liturgy. A woman's exposed hair could signify mourning or scandal, and so cleanliness of the scalp was a kind of devotion. Special combs were blessed by priests. Oils were prayed over. Scalp treatments might be accompanied by psalms or Quranic recitations, depending on the court. In convents, nuns shaved their heads. But royal women, even devout ones, rarely did. Instead, they covered meticulously. Queen Millicent of Jerusalem wore 7 layers atop her head. A silk cap, a linen scarf, a netted snood, a braided cord, a pearl circlet, a veil, and finally, a wimple. Her attendants treated her hair weakly, parting it with olive oil-soaked fingers, combing in total silence. No one but they ever saw her bare scalp. Let's pause again. The queen reclines now, hair wrapped in linen, her veil folded for the morning. A fresh comb sits on the stool. The hearth glows gently, and in the hush before sleep, there's no scratching, just peace, for now. Crowns of silence, the cultural legacy of courtly parasites, fade in slowly. The night deepens. In the corner, the coals glow low. The queen's chamber is silent, save for the occasional rustle of silk and the faint scratching of quill. On parchment, in the next room, and beneath that royal head wrap, the same quiet truths persist. Lice, fleas, dandruff, itching as we complete this story. We step back not only into more palaces and traditions across the world, but also into the echoes these small creatures left in language, ritual, and legacy. For the royal itch was more than a nuisance. It was a thread woven into the tapestry of cultural memory. Let's brush that tapestry gently now. The itch in other courts, global queens, universal problems while the European courts documented, hair care in lavish detail, queens across Asia, Africa, and the Americas also grappled with their own scalp stories, some less recorded, but no less real. In the Heian court of Japan, court ladies, like Murasaki Shikibu, described hair as a central element of butylong, dark and trailing behind them in rivers of silk. But they also mentioned, discreetly, the burden of maintaining such length. Lice combs were carved from sandalwood or cherry bark. Hair was washed with rice bran water, then combed dry under the sun. Servants gently detangled the locks, using white papers to catch lice as they fell. The papers were folded into tiny boxes burned after each session. It was done with ceremony and care. And yet itching remained an unspoken part of elegance. In the Sahelian kingdoms of West Africa, royal women of Mali and Songhai wore braided hairstyles that communicated lineage, marriage status, and wealth. But lice could nest in the tight plaits, especially in the hot, dry season. Neem oil, shea butter, and powdered cola nuts were massaged into the scalp weekly. Wooden combs with wide, ornate teeth were used to cleanse and shape. Attendants sang during grooming soft, rhythmic songs, half lullaby, half instruction. The queen was soothed, and the lice removed, one by one. Among the Nahu of pre-colonial Mexican bullwomen used infusions of yucca root and amaranth to clean their hair. The process was spiritual as well as hygienic. Lice were understood too, be caused by imbalance, not unlike the European concept of humors. Feather combs and obsidian scraping tools were employed delicately. Cleanliness of the scalp was part of a woman's preparation for ritual service. From Kyoto to Timbuktu, Tenochtitlan to Toledo, queens itched, queens combed, and queens endured. Lice in language and literature, small creatures leave long shadows. In courtly poetry, lice became metaphor. In 14th century France, a troubadour compared unspoken love to a knit beneath a golden braid, yet alive. A Spanish proverb warned, even the queen scratches when no one watches. And in Persian literature, the act of delousing became a symbol of trust. A queen who allowed another to touch her scalp extended invisible power. To comb was to confess, to scratch, to soothe, to speak while appearing not to. Even Shakespeare referenced lice mocking pomp and power with. The king may sit on velvet, yet feel the peasant's bite. Tiny insects became literary devices, reminders of mortality, intimacy, and the limits of power. Religious and mystical associations, some traditions. Parasites took on spiritual significance. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity, monks referred to lice as the small martyrs, arguing that suffering their bites built patience. A queen beset by fleas might be seen as enduring a holy test. Among early Muslim physicians, lice were understood as part of divine creation. Medical texts from Andalusia explained that cleanliness pleased God, and the removal of parasites was a meritorious act. In South Asian Ayurveda, head lice were associated with imbalances in Pitta dosha, the fire element, scented oils and turmeric. Scrubs were used not only for comfort, but for rebalancing the cosmic self. Some queens even made offerings after infestations, ended silver combs to shrines, burnt sachets of herbs, or donations to convents. To be relieved of itching was not only physical, it was spiritual. Secrets in the hair chamber, the hairdressing chamber where queens were groomed, was a place of secrets. No one else was present, no formal courtiers, no scribes, no men, just the queen and her attendants. In that space, stories were told, fears whispered, affairs confessed, wounds noticed. One queen of Navarre is said to have wept during every delousing never in public, only then. Another, Isabella of Castile, reportedly made decisions about ambassadors while having her hair braided. The groom of the stool may have wielded power for kings, but for queens, the hairdresser knew more. These attendants noticed bruises, traced scars, listened, in their records few, but telling we hear about pregnancies, melancholy, lovers, and political doubts. All spoken during the ritual scrape of combs and the dab of oils. They heard the crown's heartbeat, and never repeated it. Illness and the infestation connection parasites were not just itchy, they were dangerous. Typhus, spread by lice, occasionally ravaged court populations. In the 15th century, a German duchess's entire retinue died after an outbreak, traced back to the furs worn during a winter hunt. Scalp infections caused by scratching could become severe. Without antibiotics, small wounds festered. In some cases, queens took to bed for weeks, delirious from what began as a simple louse bite. And yet, documentation was vague. Illnesses were labeled as fevers, foul humors, or melancholic moods. Rarely were they traced to parasites. Certainly knew the link. Prevention became stricter. Some queens banned fur within their private quarters. Others had cloaks smoked over coals weekly. And yet, one cannot eliminate the world. Servants brought fleas in on shoes. Nobles carried lice from foreign courts. And life always itched. The symbolic combs in death and burial remarkably. Many queens were buried with their combs in grave sites from medieval France to China. Archaeologists have uncovered ornate grooming tools nestled beside skeletal remains. Some were broken, ceremonially retired. Others pristine, laid carefully atop the rib cage. Why? Perhaps the comb represented beauty, perhaps cleanliness, or perhaps simply comfort. For some queens, the comb was the most intimate object they owned. It touched them more than their husbands did. It accompanied them through pain, through pregnancy, through solitude. And so, when they passed, it went with them. In one 13th century Irish tomb, a queen's silver comb was found tied with linen thread. A note, now faded, had once been tucked beneath. Let her have her peace. The legacy, itching toward equality today. Of course, we have shampoos, insecticides, central heating, synthetic fabrics, but the humble headlouse remains with us, and the flea, and the urge to scratch when no one is looking. Their legacy is not just in discomfort, but in what they revealed. They taught us that queens were human, that beneath crowns and titles and rituals and marble, there were scalps, oily, sweaty, vulnerable. They reminded us that even the most powerful women in history had moments of helplessness, that intimacy lies in small acts, brushing, braiding, soothing, burning a flea in the fire. They told us that the body cannot be conquered and tended. A soft ending so here. In the stillness of midnight, we leave our queen. Her hair is braided, her comb is cleaned. The linen veil hangs neatly over her forehead. Her scalp no longer itches for now, and she dreams not of politics, not of titles, but of rosemary water, warm hands, and the sweet quiet of being touched by someone who knows how to help without needing to ask. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. Another gentle piece of forgotten royalty awaits. Story 3. The Sleep of Kings. How royalty dreamed in the Middle Ages nightfall in the castle, where kings lay their heads, asterisk drift into the shadows. ... Close your eyes and imagine the last candle flickering out in a vast stone hall. Cold air curls round wooden beams. A tapestry sways softly, touched by the night breeze snaking in through a cracked window. The bustle has faded. The court has gone still, and somewhere, in a chamber above the hearth, a king lowers himself into bed, sleep, the one equalizer, the one thing even royalty cannot command. But how did kings and queens sleep in the Middle Ages? What did they lie on? Who watched over them? What fears crept into their dreams? Let's draw the heavy velvet curtains lower, our voices, and step into the hush of medieval sleep. The royal bed, furniture or fortress. The bed of a king was not just a place of rest, was a statement, and in truth, not always comfortable. Royal beds were enormous structures, often built of oak or walnut, elevated high above the floor. Some had steps leading up, others required attendants to assist the monarch in climbing in. They were covered in embroidered hangings, layered with linen, wool, and sometimes fur. But these were not private sanctuaries in the modern sense. In early medieval courts, the king's bed was often placed in a chamber adjoining the great hall. Nobles might dine, argue, and then bed down on pallets nearby. A curtain offered some modesty, but not isolation. Gradually, as notions of royal privacy evolved, separate bedchambers were introduced. By the 13th century, kings slept behind thick doors, guarded by mintlet arms. Only a few trusted servants, and perhaps a close confidante groom of the chamber might be allowed inside. Still, the bed was a curious mix of public and private. It was a stage for royal birth, for illness, for death, and yes, for sleep, though not always peaceful. Rituals before sleep. The nightly routine in a medieval royal household followed a gentle rhythm. Before bed, the king would typically undergo a cleansing bowl of warm water, perhaps infused with herbs like lavender or chamomile, was brought to the chamber. Linen cloths were folded neatly. A page might help remove the king's slippers. Another would check that coals in the brazier still glowed, lest the room grow too cold. The windows were shuttered, and always someone watched the door. A final prayer was whispered. In Christian courts, This might be the complant, the last canonical hour of the day. In Islamic courts, the Isha prayer closed the evening. Then the monarch would lie down, often still robed in a fine nightshirt of linen or wool. Pillows were stuffed with feathers or dried rushes. The sheets were not often changed, but were shaken and scented when possible. And then perhaps the hardest task of all came the waiting noise. Chill and other enemies of sleep. The medieval castle was no haven of silence. Winds howled through stone corridors. Rats scurried between floorboards. Servants whispered. Bells rang in distant towers. And the walls, thick though they were, could not keep out all of the world. Cold was another constant companion, even with tapestries, fires, and heavy bed. A winter night could bite the bones. Queens wore nightcaps. Kings sometimes slept with gloves. One chronicler writes that Edward III of England had hot stones placed beneath his bed at night, wrapped in cloth to radiate gentle heat. But even with every precaution, the chill persisted, and in that chill, sleep often slipped away. Two sleeps, divided dreams. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval slumber was its structure. Historians now believe that people royalty included often slept in two phases. The first sleep began after dusk and lasted several hours. Then, a period of wakefulness occurred, perhaps an hour or two before the second sleep began. What did kings do during this waking hour? They prayed. They whispered to companions. Some wrote, some meditated. Others simply lay awake, listening to the creak of beams and the flutter of tapestries. In this liminal space, the mind drifted freely. It was thought to be a sacred hour, perfect for visions, dreams, or divine whispers. Monks sometimes timed their prayers to coincide with this interval, and queens might nurse children, compose poetry, or stare silently at the coals, contemplating matters of state or heart. This in-between moment, half asleep, half aware, was where dreams began to blend with reality. Dreamscapes and divine vision streams were not private fantasies in the Middle Ages. They were messages, the king's dream might be discussed by his council. A queen's nightmare could delay a journey. Dreams were interpreted by clerics, mystics, or even court physicians. Books like the Dream Book of Daniel offered elaborate codes. To dream of falling was a warning. To dream of water meant change. To dream of animals foretold omens, good or ill. Some monarchs feared their dreams. Others sought them out. Charlemagne was said to have dreamt of a sword broken in three, which his advisors read as a prophecy of dynastic division. Queen Matilda of Tuscany once dreamt of a burning crown shortly before her political fall. But dreams weren't only about politics. They were also personal. A king mourning a lost child might dream of holding them again. A queen, lonely in her tower, might dream of the sea endless, peaceful, beyond reach. And for those who couldn't sleep, the dreams never came. The watchers in the night royal sleep was rarely solitary. Someone always kept watch. Chamber guards stood outside the door, and attendants slept nearby in case the monarch stirred. In some courts, the groom of the chamber slept on a pallet at the foot of the royal bed. But not all watchers were welcome. Rumors of poison, assassination, or sorcery plagued many courts. Food was tasted, sheets were inspected, spells were broken. With holy water in the court of Louis XI, a priest blessed the king's bed each night with a candle. In Ottoman harems, eunuchs guarded the women's quarters and listened for disturbances. And still, despite the vigilance, kings lay awake, because No amount of watching could stop the racing thoughts, the regrets, the plans, the images that lingered after the candles were snuffed. A monarch might command armies, but could not command sleep. Let us pause here. The king lies still now. His breath is even. The fire has dimmed. Outside the castle, sleeps, but the night is far from over. Another sleep awaits. Or perhaps a dream will return to him soon. Sleepless sovereigns, bedside superstitions, and the ghosts that lingered asterisks stirring in the dark. The castle is silent, but the royal bed is restless. A creak, a sigh, the soft rustle of linen sheets turned over again. The king does not sleep, nor does the queen. They lie awake perhaps only in mind, or perhaps in body, too confronting what so many in power must confront eventually, that sleep cannot be bought, bribed, or battled into submission. It must be courted, soothed, allowed, and sometimes it simply does not come. Tonight, we explore the long hours of royal insomnia, the potions, the prayers, the fears that stirred beside them, the superstitions, and the unseen figures, real or imagined, that haunted royal dreams. Sleeplessness. The uncrowned affliction to rule a kingdom was to shoulder immense weight, and for many monarchs, that weight grew heaviest in the quiet hours. Insomnia plagued royal courts across cultures. Letters from Henry IV of England mention nights of unrest, during which he paced his chambers by candlelight. Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire recorded dreams that would not end, loops of anxiety that pulled him from sleep again and again. But the causes were not always metaphysical. Heavy clothing, overheated rooms, stomach ailments from lavish dinners, anxiety over heirs, pain from wounds or illness, guilt, grief. A sleepless monarch was not just tired. They were vulnerable, irritable, prone to suspicion. In the court of Philip the Fair of France, servants rotated in pairs to sit with him through the night, not to speak, just to be present. A form of silent companionship meant to ease his mind, and when even that failed, the kingdom waited until the king's rest returned, because nothing moved. If he did not sleep, sleeping potions and sedative recipes royal physicians worked hard to bring sleep to their lords. They concocted potions, syrups, and elixirs made from the herbal pharmacopoeia of their era. These recipes were carefully recorded in hand-inked books, guarded by guilds and passed down like treasure. Popular ingredients included poppy syrup made from the white latex of the opium poppy, diluted with honey, valerian root, crushed and steeped, known for its calming effects, chamomile, boiled into tea, often mixed with milk or wine, mandrake root, a dangerous soporific used in tiny amounts due to its toxicity, lettuce water, believed to cool the body's hot humors. Bringing ease, physicians often advise taking these remedies just after the Compline prayers, when the body had begun to wind down. If the drink didn't work, other methods followed: massaging the temples with lavender oil, burning sweetwood or myrrh in the chamber, stroking the forehead gently with silk or down. The queen might hum. The king might recite psalms. Sometimes a servant simply sat and fanned the air until the monarch's breath slowed. Faith and sleep, nighttime prayers and divine guardians in the Middle Ages, sleep was deeply spiritual for Christians. Falling asleep was a symbolic rehearsal of death and awakening, a resurrection. This made nightly prayers a vital part of the sleep ritual. Many monarchs knelt beside their beds, praying for safe slumber. They asked for protection from incubi, Demons said to press upon the chest. They called on Saint Michael, protector in dreams. Some slept with a rosary under their pillow, or a crucifix stitched into the headrest. In Islamic courts, kings and sultans recited Quranic verses before sleep, particularly Ayat al-Kursi, known for its protective power. Amulets were tucked under pillows. Doors were marked with protective inscriptions. In Jewish households, psalms were recited, and children were taught to say the Shema before bed. The line between sleep and death was thin. It was a sacred crossing, and the devout crossed it carefully. The night visitors, ghosts, spirits, and superstitions, not all who disturbed royal sleep were alive. Many kings and queens believed in night spirits. In dreams, the dead might speak, offering advice, warnings, or silent stares. Such encounters were not taken lightly. Charlemagne once claimed to have been visited by Saint Peter in a dream, who instructed him to build a chapel on a specific hill. He did so the very next day, but not all visions were divine. Some kings feared their ancestors. Others feared the people they had wronged. Henry II of England is said to have wept in his sleep, crying out the name of Thomas Becket, his former friend and archbishop, murdered in Canterbury Cathedral in Eastern Europe. Queens lit candles for the restless dead before bed. In some cases, attendants scattered salt at the corners of the chamber to ward off evil. Mirrors were turned to face the wall, lest spirits slip through. Dreams were not private. They echoed through courts. They shaped policy. A single nightmare might cancel a wedding. A vision might delay a campaign. They were believed to be divine. Post-dot and monarchs listened. Deathbeds and final sleeps eventually. Every royal sleep becomes the last. In medieval chronicles, the deaths of kings are recorded in almost poetic terms. The bedchamber becomes sacred. The hangings drawn. Candles placed at each corner. Often, a priest or bishop would be called to perform last rites while the monarch still breathed. Confession, communion, then the laying down for those who lingered. Dreams visited with force. Some spoke of gardens, of rivers, a family long gone. Others clutched the sheets and muttered curses, seeing demons in the rafters. The final breath was met with silence. The chamber emptied, and the bed often burned, or dismantled, or given to the church, because the place where a king died was not to be used again. It had become too holy or too haunted. The attendants who remembered Droyle. Dreams may not have been written down, but they were remembered. Attendants carried stories from one queen to the next. Chambermaids whispered about what the king said in sleep. Pages recalled which nights the monarch awoke, screaming. These memories were not gossip. They were legacy. One servant of King Charles VI of France, who suffered bouts of madness, kept a record of his master's night terrors. In it, she wrote, "His Majesty sees horses aflame. He weeps when the moon is full. He calls for his mother, though she has been gone these 20 winters." These records, unofficial and tender, tell us more about royalty than any treaty, because in sleep, the crown slips, the body softens, and the truth surfaces unguarded, unadorned, unbearably human. Let's leave our monarch here. He has fallen asleep at last. His crown rests on a stool beside the bed. A candle burns low. His fingers twitch slightly, perhaps from a dream, or perhaps from memory. He will sleep through the second watch, into the quietest hour, and we will return. Beds of power, dreams of legacy. And the quiet sleep of history * fade gently into the final watch, The stars are pale above the battlements. The third watch has begun. In the royal bedchamber, the fire is down to glowing ash. The thick curtains hang still, and the monarch lies at last in untroubled rest. Let us now wander through the beds that shaped history, not the battlefield. But the literal bed where marriages were consummated, heirs conceived, alliances sealed in shared sleep, and lonely monarchs dreamed beside cold sheets. This is the quiet legacy of powerless sleep that followed every treaty, every war, every whispered secret. And though time has moved on, the scent of lavender, the softness of linen, and the haunting echo of a dream still linger. The royal bed as stage and statementing medieval life. The bed was not only for rest. Royal beds were stages of statecraft. They were witnesses to pivotal moments in a dynasty. When a king married, his wedding bed was the centerpiece of ceremony. It was paraded before the court elaborately dressed with brocade, ribbons, and fruiting bows. Witnesses observed the couple retiring together, and in some cases, stayed in the room until the first sheets were stained. Yes, the beds of monarchs were literally observed, sometimes recorded, and often politicized. The presence or absence of children in a royal bed led to international anxieties. Failed pregnancies, known in sorrowful whispers as still cradles, were tied to dynastic instability. An infertile marriage bed was a matter of state. Some queens were moved from one bedchamber to another, superstition guiding the belief that a change of room might bring a change in fortune. One king, desperate for an heir, had his bed rebuilt from cedar wood imported from the Holy Land. Another slept with his feet facing Mecca, hoping for divine favor, even in slumber. The royal body served the realm. Bedding ceremonies and courtly sleep customs let us not forget the rituals around going to bed in many European courts. The coucher du roi, the king's going to bed was a formal event at Versailles. Though later than the medieval period, it evolved into public theatre. But its roots can be seen even in earlier courts. Servants lining up in silence, nobles lighting the candles, and the king solemnly removing his robes. In earlier centuries, this was a quieter affair, but no less symbolic. The act of disrobing was, both literal and metaphoric, the laying aside of temporal power for a few hours of vulnerability. The last thing a monarch might see before sleep was not his family or consort, but his chamberlain and confess. In Islamic courts, nighttime rituals were similar. The Sultan was blessed, his slippers removed, incense burned, and a quiet Quranic verse recited at the foot of his mattress. Even Mongol khans, who lived in yurts instead of palaces, had structured sleeping protocols. Their beds faced east. A guard stood nearby at all hours. Dreams were shared with shamans, who interpreted the symbols of the steppe. Everywhere, sleep was sacred, guarded, blessed, and never taken for granted. Dreams as dynasty, prophecy in sleep. The dreams of kings and queens were not idle fancies. They were treated as prophecy. A dream of blood was feared. A dream of birds, a sign of change. A dream of fire, dangerous. Kings kept dream interpreters on retainer. These could be monks, mystics, astrologers, or even poets. They listened patiently as the monarch recalled fragments. A silver tree fell into the sea. I walked across a bridge of mirrors. A lion spoke my name. These images were read carefully. Dreams shaped policy. In one documented case, a queen dreamed of a broken chain and insisted her husband delay a diplomatic journey. 2 weeks later, An ambush struck the very road he would have traveled. Another monarch dreamed of drowning shortly before his fleet was lost in a storm. The dream, some said, was a divine warning ignored. But not all dreams were dire. Some kings dreamed of old friends, of sunny meadows, of laughter. They awoke with passant, issued pardons, or visited old allies, or sat in silence, watching the sun rise over the courtyard, because dreams were not only omens, they were memory, longing, hope, the bedchamber as mirror of rule in sleep. All guards drop, and so a monarch's bedchamber often reflected there. Soul, some were austere, a plain bed, a single chair, a crucifix. These kings often ruled harshly, disciplined and cold. Others surrounded themselves with comfort, pillows, pets, warm milk. They ruled gently, they listened, they wept often. Some surrounded themselves with tokens locks of hair from lost children, letters from mothers, relics of saints. They feared the night, and in that fear they ruled with suspicion. A queen who slept with open shutters might believe she had nothing to hide. A king who required 3 locked doors between himself and the hall might be hiding from something real or imagined. Even the smallest detail revealed much. The perfume on the sheets, the absence of a consort, the angle of the bed to the fire. If you wanted to understand a monarch, servants said, watch them sleep. When dreams turned to nightmares. Not every night was peaceful. Some monarchs suffered night terrors. King Charles VI of France famously believed he was made of glass. He feared breaking in his sleep. He lay rigid, unmoving, terrified of shattering. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, much later in history, but echoing medieval patterns, slept all day and wandered by candlelight through his palaces at night, murmuring to himself, dreaming while awake. But in the Middle Ages, night disturbances were often blamed on demons. Incubi spirits that pinned sleepers to the bed were a feared presence. Some kings slept with blessed relics under their pillows. Others required a priest to visit each morning and cleanse the bed with holy words. Still others feared betrayal more than demons. Henry IV of England sometimes slept in his armor. Byzantine emperors arranged to be awoken by their guards every 2 hours to ensure they still lived. Sleep was never safe, but it was necessary. Threads left on the pillow, and what of those left behind? When a monarch died, the bed was stripped, the linens burned, the pillow kept for a time by the queen or heir in one Spanish court. The final sheet of the king was embroidered with his seal and preserved in a reliquary. Queens sometimes requested to be buried with their husband's nightshirt, or a bit of hair found on the pillow, or a ribbon from the bed curtain. The bed was not just where a monarch died, it was where they laughed, whispered, forgave, reflected. It held their scent, their weight, their fears. In many ways, it knew them better than any courtier, and once empty, it remained that way for days, sometimes weeks, out of reverence or hesitation, because who dares lie in the sleep of kings? A final dream let's end with one quiet tale, a chronicle from 14th century. Hungary records that Queen Elizabeth once dreamed of a winding stair of stars. At its top was a garden. In it, her mother sat, weaving. Elizabeth awoke with tears on her cheeks and ordered her maids to leave the room. She sat alone until morning. That day, she began the construction of a new monastery dedicated to silence, to solitude, to sleep. It still stands, and at its center is a small room, stone, empty, once filled with soft tapestries and a feather bed, where, perhaps, a queen dreamed of peace. The final rest, so now the king sleeps. The candles are out. The chamber is still. He has dreamed his dreams, turned on his side, released the burdens of the crown, if only until dawn. His guards stand watch. His scribe waits. The linen is smooth. The fire has gone cold, and all is quiet. Because in the end, no matter how powerful, how proud, how feared, even kings must sleep. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. A new story whispers from history's quietest corners. Story 4. The Queen's Monthly Retreat. Menstruation, myths, and courtly seclusion. The hidden chamber, silence, cycles, and the politics of the royal body. Asterisk, gently now, into the quiet. The great hall is loud. Pages rush to and fro. Nobles bicker softly over parchment. A bishop bows as he passes the throne. But far from this bustle, in a chamber draped in linen and lavender, a queen rests. Not ill, not banished, just on retreat. Because once a month, regardless of war or treaty, festival or fast, a queen's body followed its own calendar. And when it did, the world slowed around her. The doors closed. The tapestries muffled the sound, and her name might vanish briefly from court records tot night. We open one of the quietest doors in history, the one that led to the royal menstrual chamber, a cycle in silence. Menstruation in the medieval Minden, the Middle Ages. Menstruation was not merely physical light, was symbolic, powerful, feared, sacred. To bleed was to be impure, some said. To be mystical, said others. Physicians, priests, midwives, and scholars all had their theories, and nearly all of them spoke more than they listened to the women who bled. For queens, their menstrual cycles were tightly recorded, especially if they were young, married, and expected to bear heirs. The arrival of menses was cause for both quiet relief and concern. Too early, and it might signal frailty. Too late, and tongues began to wag. Was she ill? Was she pregnant? Was she cursed? And through it all, the queen endured month after month, year after year, while cloaked in privacy and protocol. But what did this monthly experience actually look like for a woman who wore a crown? Let's step inside her chamber and find out. The seclusion room most royal courts across medieval Europe, the Islamic world, and even parts of Asia practiced some form of seclusion during menstruation. It varied, sometimes symbolic, sometimes strict. In Christian Europe, menstruating women were considered ritually unclean. While peasants continued working regardless, queens often retreated to designated spaces. A smaller chamber adjoining the royal apartments. A veiled tent during travel. A curtained alcove behind the chapel. Here, the queen would rest. She might bathe. She would not participate in public mass. In some courts, she was excused from court proceedings altogether. Records from the court of Queen Blanche of Castile mention her soft days, during which her public appearances ceased. Her meals were served in solitude. Her letters paused in the Jewish royal households of medieval Spain. The laws of Nida were observed. The queen refrained from physical contact with the king. She kept to a separate bedchamber. She bathed ritually at the end of the cycle in a mikvafen, an ornate, marble-tiled space built into the palace foundations, and in Islamic courts. Women on their periods abstained from ritual prayer and fasting, but remained dignified, cared for, and cloistered gently from ceremonial events. The world spun without them, but barely. What she wore, layers, linings, and quiet comfort there were no sanitary products as we know them today. No pads, no tampons, no synthetic liners. Royal women used cloths often finely woven, linen folded and pinned or tied around the waist with laces. Some used wool, others wore padded drawers, lined with absorbent moss or cotton. Multiple layers were common. An inner cloth layer changed as needed. An outer skirt designed to disguise staining. A long tunic, perhaps in dark colors during this time. Privacy was paramount. Attendants washed the cloths discreetly. Some queens had personal laundresses, who handled nothing else paid handsomely, sworn to silence. Certain royal garments, known as monthly robes, were worn only during this time. They were often thicker, plainer, and darkly dyed burgundy, charcoal, deep green. These garments signaled the queen's retreat without ever speaking it. Pain and remedies. Menstrual pain, of course, did not spare queens. They cramped, they bled heavily, some fainted, others grew feverish. And in an age where even physicians feared the womb, treatments were often based on guesswork and folklore. Common remedies included warm compresses of chamomile and lavender, infusions of yarrow, mugwort, or fennel poultices made of honey, and crushed nettle leaves, hot stones wrapped in linen and placed on the belly. Some queens chewed on pieces of ginger. Others soaked their feet in hot water infused with marjoram. A few were known to fast for a day or chew, believing lightness of body would ease the flow. In Islamic medical texts, such as those by Avicenna, the cycle was discussed with care. Painful menstruation, dysmenorrhea, was treated with saffron tea, baths scented with frankincense, and gentle massage in European herbals. Women's wine was brewed, red wine steeped with cinnamon, bay leaves, and rose petals taken warm, sipped slowly, best before bed, and then there were prayers. Queens knelt quietly, even in pain, asking their patron saints for ease. Saint Margaret, the protector of childbirth, was often invoked. So was Saint Bridget, herself a healer. Pain was endured, not publicly, not loudly, but with dignity, scent, cleanliness, and sacred air. Let us not forget the senses. The royal menstrual chamber smelled differently to mask bodily odors. Queens surrounded themselves with fragrance. Lavender bundles hung from the ceiling. Bowls of rose petals sat on windowsills. Coals burned cinnamon bark and cloves. Cloth pads were often scented with mint oil or dried sage before use. The entire experience was designed to soften, if not erase, any evidence of menstruation. Bathing was a luxury and a necessity, though hot baths were sometimes discouraged, believed to cause heavy flow. Warm rinses were permitted. Queens bathed in rainwater steeped with rosemary or milk. Servants poured slowly. Linen towels were warmed by the fire. Cleanliness was both practical and symbolic. To be clean was to be pure. To be fragrant was to be in control. And in a world where women's bodies were often seen as mysterious, threatening, or shameful, control was everything. Let's pause here. The queen lies in her chamber, a bowl of petals by her bed, a linen cloth folded on the stool. Outside, the court feasts. But inside, she rests, not idle, not exiled, simply herself. And tomorrow, or the next day, the doors will open again. Taboos, timekeeping, and the political body of a queen asterisk in the stillness between days. The candles are tall now. Time has passed since the queen first withdrew to her chamber. Her meals have been simpler. Her visitors fewer presents, politely avoided in courtly conversation. But beyond the hush of the chamber lies a web of expectations, suspicions, and ancient beliefs. Because a royal woman's cycle was more than a personal rhythm, it was clockwork for the court, a whisper of fertility, a symbol of power and of risk. Tonight, we follow the trail of the Queen's blood through calendars, medicine, and mythology. Because in medieval times, the menstrual cycle was a deeply political matter. The Queen, as calendar menstruation, was one of the few consistent biological rhythms in medieval life. And for queens, it became part of royal record-keeping. Not formally, then in practice, court physicians kept journals. Herbalists marked when the Queen sent for feverfew or mugwort. Maids noted when the linen pouches needed preparing. And while few of these records survive directly, their echoes remain. For example, in the 13th century, Eleanor of Provence's household logs show a lull in her correspondence and travel every 4 weeks. In the Spanish court of Isabella I, midwives and medical attendants met privately once a month with the Queen, often around the new moon. These routines shaped policy. Audiences were postponed. Long journeys were rescheduled. Peace talks were delayed not because of weakness, but because the Queen's body required space, and in the minds of many, her cycles tied directly to her ability to produce heirs, menstruation and fertility. The waiting game, Queen, as fertility was state business, and so her period saw, their absence were, watched closely in newly married queens. The arrival of menstruation was a bittersweet sign. Healthy, yes, but not yet pregnant. When menses failed to arrive, anticipation grew. Was she with child, or simply late, or ill? A delay of even a week could spark palace gossip. Noblewomen would whisper. Ambassadors sent coded letters. Priests prayed. And the Queen, often in silence, waited. She might feel the stirrings of hope, the weight of expectation. She might know the answer and hold it close. Or she might wonder herself, counting days, watching her body for signs. And sometimes the bleeding returned. Her chamber would be scented again. Her comfort linens changed, and no one would say a word, but everyone would know. Menstrual myths and misunderstandings, medieval medicine, built on the writings of Galen, Aristotle, and Avicenna, had many theories about menstruation. Some saw it as purification, a monthly cleansing of excess humors. Others believed menstrual blood could spoil wine, dull mirrors, or wither crops. Even queens were not spared these myths. A bishop once refused to share communion wine with a menstruating queen. One French chronicler claimed a mare miscarried because a bleeding woman brushed its flank. In parts of Italy, it was believed that a menstruating queen should not walk through a vineyard, lest the grapes soured these ideas. Rooted in fear and misunderstanding, shaped how queens were treated during their cycles. They were protected, but also separated, honored, but isolated. The moon and the woman, many courts. The Queen's cycle was linked to the phases of the moon. This belief, ancient and widespread, saw the moon as a feminine power. It waxed and waned, as did women. It governed tides and blood. Queens who bled with the full moon were thought to be especially fertile. Those whose cycles strayed from the lunar calendar were sometimes given herbal balancing treatments. Moon charts were kept in some royal households. Queens timed baths, fasts, and certain prayers to the moon's rhythm in Islamic courts. Where the lunar calendar shaped religious life, this connection was even more deeply felt. While menstruating, women were excused from fasting and prayer, but remained spiritually conscious. The moon, after all, marked everything, and so, A queen might sit by her window, watching the moon slip between clouds, knowing her own body followed an ancient dance celestial, silent, enduring. The flow a symbol in rare cases, menstruation became a symbol of defiance or power. A 15th century Burgundian queen is said to have displayed her blood-stained shift privately, and only to her ladies, after a rumor claimed she was barren in some fertility rites. Royal blood, literal or symbolic, was considered sacred. Offerings made from menstrual cloths were buried in fields to feed the land. These practices, often older than Christianity or Islam, lingered in folk memory and in literature. A queen's period could signal power or transformation. A bleeding woman was liminal between worlds, between creation and destruction, between maiden and mother, between quiet and voice. Though rarely discussed aloud, her body spoke nonetheless. Purity and religious restrictions, norms shaped how a menstruating queen moved through her world in Christian theology. Drawn from Leviticus and medieval canon law, menstruation was seen as a state of impurity. A queen might be excused from touching sacred objects. She would not enter the altar space or partake in communion. In Islamic courts, similar boundaries existed. A menstruating queen did not perform ritual prayers or enter the prayer space, but she remained spiritually engaged, reciting supplications and performing charity. In Jewish law, strict niddah rules governed contact. A queen might not sit on her husband's chair, might not share a cup, but after immersion in the mikveh, she returned renewed. These boundaries were not always cruel. Often they gave the queen a pause from the pressures of court, a moment to herself, a moment to bleed, to reflect, to rest, and then to emerge. Let's pause again. The queen leans back on her cushions. Her hands rest on her belly. A book lies open beside her half-read. Outside, a hawk circles in a silver sky. Her chamber smells of rosemary and warmth. She is not sick, not weak. She is simply bleeding. And in that, there is rhythm, and power, and peace. Red threads, legacy, lineage, and the quiet strength of the menstruating queen, asterisk, a final thread. Unseen, but unbroken, ... The court has resumed its rhythm. The queen has returned. Her veil is crisp, her smile practiced. Her blood no longer flows. Not for now, but beneath her bodice. Beneath the silence of her chamber and the echo of cloistered footsteps, something endures. The rhythm of her cycle, the red thread of inheritance, and the quiet strength that was never truly hidden. This final section explores how menstruation shaped royal succession, how it lived in folklore and fear, and how despite centuries of discomfort queens endured, not in spite of their blood, but with it. Let us begin at the root of legacy itself, the womb, the menstruating womb and royal inheritance too. Be a queen was to be a vessel of dynasty, whether she ruled in her own right or as consort, a queen's. Body was often reduced to one function, bearing children, and at the center of that expectation was her cycle. Menstruation was both proof and threat. Proof that she was fertile, threat that she was not yet pregnant. Chroniclers watched queens. Bellies more than their policies. The queen quickens was a headline. The queen bleeds was a whisper. The absence of menstruation when hoped for could means celebration. But if pregnancy failed to follow, suspicion crept in. Was she bewitched, infertile, a fraud? Queens were examined by midwives, questioned by priests, scrutinized by ambassadors, and yet the blood never stopped being her own. Hers alone, Sometimes it carried a child. Sometimes it carried a legacy that would never be, and always. It carried meaning, miscarriage, and the politics of Panda. Royal womb was not a private place. When pregnancy failed, when the blood returned, unexpectedly was recorded in journals, sermons, and political letters. But rarely was it spoken of with compassion. Miscarriages were often explained through sin, imbalance, or fate. Some blamed the queen, others her ladies. Some blamed nothing at all, and still she grieved in silence. Queen Anne of Bohemia lost multiple children. Chroniclers note the dates, but not her sorrow. Queen Catherine of Aragon, married to Henry VIII, miscarried again and again, each time more quietly, more desperately. The cloths were washed in private, the bed stripped silently. The court resumed, but the queen carried the memory, and her next bleeding day was met not with relief, but dread. Lineage and the burden of the monthly mark in dynasties where bloodline determined power. The queen's monthly cycle became political leverage. A menstruating queen could not be pregnant. A menstruating daughter might not yet be marriageable. A menstruating widow could still remarry and produce heirs for another line. These facts drove treaties, dowries, and wars. In the court of Charlemagne, princesses were kept in careful seclusion once they began menstruating, guarded not for safety, but for potential. Their value had changed. Their blood now signified legacy, and for queens who failed to produce sons, each period that returned was a cruel announcement of absence. Not just a child not born, but a future not secured. Their bodies spoke volumes in silence. Traveling while bleeding royal life required movement, pilgrimages, progresses, journeys by sea or carriage, and the queen's body came with her, cycle and all. Traveling while menstruating was difficult. The jostling of carriages worsened cramping. Lavatories were scarce and uncomfortable. Privacy was limited, yet queens endured. Attendants carried bundles of cloth, herbs, and oils. A small chest, sometimes locked, contained the queen's necessaries. During her bleeding days, her carriage might be lined with extra velvet cushions. Her schedule lightened. In some cases, she chose not to travel. A documented delay in Eleanor of Aquitaine's royal progress was likely tied to her cycle, though the records simply say she was at needful rest. In these choices, we glimpse autonomy, small, quiet acts of self-care amid the machinery of court. Queens in cloisters, religion and menstrual shelter, not all. Queens bled in palaces. Some spent their menstruation in convents or secluded gardens overseen by nuns. In these spaces, menstruation was not shameful, it was understood. In Eastern Orthodox lands, royal women sometimes withdrew to small chapels adjoining women's monasteries. They prayed, rested, bathed. The mikveh of Jewish queens, already described, was often a place of peace, tone-tiled, domed, echoing with water and whispers. Islamic royal harems had inner quarters designed for comfort during menses, sunlit rooms, with open windows, pillows piled high, musicians playing soft melodies. Here, women spoke freely, shared stories, compared herbs and remedies. In these rare moments, queens were not symbols, they were simply women. Menstrual cloths and the politics of disposal, even waste, held meaning. Menstrual cloths were washed, boiled, and dried with discretion. But their disposal, when worn beyond use, was ritualized. Some were burned, believed to carry spiritual risk. Others were buried, often beneath gardens, in northern Europe. Cloths might be offered to the Virgin Mary hung briefly in chapels before destruction. In some Islamic courts, used cloths were burned with myrrh to neutralize their energetic heat. In Jewish tradition, old cloths were buried with blessings given back to the earth, because menstrual blood was not just waste. It was essence. It had power, respected, feared, and treated accordingly. The blood in story and song in folklore. Menstrual blood was often magical in Celtic tales. The blood of a queen could summon prophecy. In some German legends, a woman who bled on the soil could wake the dead. In Andalusian songs, bleeding was tied to longing. The moon returns, and I remember her linen. These stories, exaggerated perhaps, reflect cultural awe, a quiet recognition that this monthly event, hidden though it was, shaped the world. The queen bled, and therefore the kingdom might bloom, or suffer, or change. Letters, diaries, and personal accounts, though formal records rarely name menstruation. Personal letters tell us more. A 14th century princess writes to her sister, "The cloths came early. I am glad, though the ache is bad. The roses have helped." A noblewoman in Hungary writes, "The queen is at her chamber. We wait." These fragments, so simple, carry entire months of ritual, emotion, and resilience. They show us the unspoken truth that behind every crown was a cycle. Behind every throne, a chamber. Behind every treaty, a woman who bled, healed, and rose again. Closing the curtains, so now, the queen steps again into court. Her face is composed, her gestures practiced, her robes no longer stained though. The memory lingers. She smiles, she nods, she rules. No one says a word about the past few days. No one asks. But in the glance of her closest maid, in the subtle shift of her step, something is acknowledged. She has returned. She will return again, and when she does, the chamber will wait warm, quiet, lavender-scented and ready to receive her, one cycle at a time. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. Another curious corner of royal history awaits. Story 5. Banquets and bellyaches. The strange foods of royal feast. Swelcome to the table, the ritual. Rancid and ridiculous meals of medieval monarchs. Asterisk, dim the lights, light the candles. The hearth glows orange, the rushes beneath. Your feet are freshly strewn. Torches line the great hall, casting long flickering shadows against carved stone walls. And in the center of it, all our banquet table stretches like a river of gold and silver. Trays glisten, platters steam, jesters dance in the periphery. A roast swan glowers from its dish, feathers reaffixed after cooking, and the king, already seated, smiles faintly. But what did royalty really eat? What did they drink? What happened when the feast ended? The belly complained. Tonight we step softly behind the table, past the piles of meat, the jugs of spiced wine, and the linen, napkins stitched with royal arms. Tonight we feast, slowly, deliberately, with all 5 senses until we, too, feel the weight of it. Let us begin with the table itself, setting the stage. The royal table lay royal. Meal was not just food, it was theater, ceremony, a symbol of power and divine order. The table was long, raised on a platform known as a dais, so the monarch and their chosen guests would sit above all others. The seats were her-backed, carved with heraldic symbols. The table might be covered with 3 layers of cloth, linen, wool, and silk, sometimes even cloth of gold. Before any food was served, there was a hand-washing ritual. Pages presented basins and towels to each noble guestess, especially the king and queen. A moment of purification. Scented water, sometimes steeped in rose or bay, was poured from silver ewers. Then the servers emerged bearing trays covered in cloth dots. There were no forks, only knives, spoons, and fingers. And so began the feast. A parade of dishes, food as spectacle feasts could last hours, even days. The first course was often meant to stimulate appetite: pottage, a thick stew of meat and barley, or a delicate broth flavored with ginger and clove. Then came the meat, so much meat, roasted venison, marinated in vinegar and wine, stuffed pigeons, baked inside pies, boar's head, presented whole, with apple in mouth and gilded tusks, swans, served redressed in their own feathers, peacocks, flambéed, and placed on silver trays with tails spread. But these were not everyday meals. These were royal banquet special occasions, such as coronations, weddings, saint days, or treaties. And food was a performance. At one French coronation, a pie was opened, and 24 live birds flew out, causing gasps and delight. At another, a roast pig was carved at the table by a blindfolded knight, demonstrating both skill and danger. It was not enough to eat. One had to be amazed. Bread and trencher, the edible plate. The medieval feast did not offer porcelain or ceramic plates for most guests. Instead, one ate from a trencher, a thick, stale slice of bread, sometimes several days old. This bread absorbed juices, sauces, and grease. By the end of the meal, it was soaked and soft. A noble might eat part of it. More often, it was given to the poor or tossed to the dogs. In some cases, it was dried again and fed to pigs. The king's trencher, however, was often made of silver or pewter. Royal bread might be fresh, perfumed, or even dyed with saffron. And bread was never just bread. It was ritual. A page would present it on bended knee. A carver sliced it before the monarch with exacting gestures. No crumbs, no mistakes. Bread was honor and symbolism. The aromatics, spices, sauces, and exotic touches. To taste medieval royal food was to step into a world of bold, surprising flavors. Sweet and savory, blended freely. Dishes were heavily spiced, not because food was rotten a myth, but because spices were luxurious, expensive, and symbolic of wealth. A royal pantry might contain cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from the Moluccas, ginger from India, pepper from the Malabar coast, cloves, mace, saffron, cardamom. Sauces were thickened with breadcrumbs or crushed almonds, tinted with verjuice, sour grape juice, or sweetened with honey. Fish might be cooked in almond milk. Pork could be served with raisins and vinegar, veal in rosewater, duck in plum sauce. The medieval palate was bold-layered and fragrant, and the result intoxicating. Drink deep, wines, ales, and medicinal waters. Water was often distrusted, especially in cities. Instead, royals drank wine, ale, and occasionally herbal waters. Wines were not dry as modern palates expect. They were sweetened, spiced, and diluted. Hippocras, red wine with cinnamon, sugar, and cloves. Posset, a warm mix of milk, ale, and honey, soothing before bed. Mead, honey wine, thick and warming. Ale, often weaker than beer, consumed daily even by children. Some queens drank rosewater mixed with syrup after meals to cool the stomach. Kings might take a draught of bitter wormwood wine for digestion. And of course, there were toasts to the king, the saints, the alliance, the bride. The battle just one glass was rare. Most drank from wooden or metal goblets, but the monarch drank. From crystal, silver, or enamel to drink was not merely to quench thirst. It was to affirm power. Sweet endings, the medieval dessert. There were no chocolate cakes, no ice creams, but dessert known as the subtlety was often the most theatrical part of the feast. Imagine a castle made of sugar and almond paste, candied flowers in golden bowls, marzipan sculptures of saints or swans, apples poached in wine and perfumed with rosewater. These were served with comfort small candied fennel or coriander seeds, meant to soothe digestion and freshen breath. And sometimes a final drink, spiced wine taken slowly as musicians played a final tune. Then the monarch rose. The feast was done, and the trouble began. Let us pause here, just after the laughter fades. The dishes are cleared, the torches dim, and the king. He holds his belly and leans slowly in his chair, because not every royal stomach was as strong as the throne it sat behind. Tomorrow there may be consequences, digestive distress, curious remedies, and the fragile guts of the great asterisk. After the feast comes the groan, ... The laughter has faded. The jester's last rhyme hangs limp in the air. The meat platters have been cleared, their bones left gleaming, and the torches are low now, flickering as the guests retire. But not all sleep comes easily. The king lies on his side, pressing a hand to his gut. The queen leans back in her cushions, pale. Across the keep, a knight limps to the latrine. In the chapel garden, a servant softly vomits into the basil bush, because medieval feasting came at a price. Tonight, we walk with slow steps into the groaning aftermath of royal banquets through indigestion, flatulence, constipation, and the many colorful cures, because the history of the royal stomach is not just about indulgence. It's about survival. Let us begin with what happens when a king eats too well. Overindulgence, when too much meant trouble. Royal banquets were measured not in courses, but in opulence. A monarch's prestige was directly tied to how much they could offer and, by extension, consume. But royal digestion was as fragile as any peasant's. Excess meat, thick sauces, sweet wines, rich pastries, all layered upon one another across a 3 to 5 hour stretch. Common symptoms after a feast included bloating, cramping, acid reflux, known as hot throat constipation, headache from wine, forerunner to hangovers, sudden diarrhea described politely as urgent humors, and so the royal physician entered the picture. Quickly, the physicians arrive, humors and hot bellies in medieval medicine. Digestion was governed by the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Food affected these balances. Spicy meat, too much heat; cold wine, too much moisture; tart sauce, melancholic danger. After a feast, if the king felt ill, the court physician would assess: was the belly distended? Was the pulse fluttering? Had the stool been passed that day? Was there sweat behind the ears? A diagnosis followed: obstruction, imbalanced heat, or clogged spleen, and then the purge. Flatulence and the royal fart, though rarely recorded. In formal history, flatulence was an everyday concern, especially after feasts. In private, it was joked about. Some jesters made their careers from fart humor. One French noblewoman was known to bet on who would break wind first after a feast. But for the monarch, it was politically sensitive. One 14th century English document records a banquet where the queen excused herself, claiming the pressing of nature. Her absence delayed a toast and launched a dozen rumors to prevent gas buildup. Guests were advised to eat comfits, candied fennel seeds, peppermint wine, aniseed cakes. Some noblemen carried scented sachets under their tunics, not for perfume, but to mask the outcome of an ill-timed expulsion. And when it happened, despite precautions, eyes were averted. Nothing said, because dignity, even in the face of bodily betrayal, was paramount. Laxatives and digestive opens, if the issue was blockage, not noise. The treatment was more deliberate. Laxatives were known as opens or softeners. They came in many forms: fig syrup, mixed with warm water, boiled prunes, eaten before bed, licorice root, chewed slowly, cassia pods, infused in wine, purgative wine, made with senna and ginger in wealthier courts. These remedies were taken weekly, not just post-feast. The idea was to maintain a rhythm of release, like winding a clock. Constipation was feared. It was seen not just as discomfort, but as spiritual stagnation, blocked emotion, withheld truth. Some queens would fast for a day or two after a major banquet, drinking only diluted broth and resting near the garderobe. And of course, there were enemas, the royal clyster, enemas and gentlemen of the Syringian enema, or clyster, was not uncommon in royal courts. In fact, it was often considered a luxury treatment, a sign that one could afford both time and servants to administer it. The clyster syringe was typically made of brass in Islamic and Byzantine courts, silver in high medieval Europe. Carved bone in simpler households, the liquid varied: warm olive oil, honey, water, milk, with mint, thin porridge infused with sage. A trusted servant, Fotin, a court physician, or apothecary, would administer the clyster in a private chamber. The king lay on his side, covered with linen. Candles were dimmed, and after the treatment he rested, often wrapped in fur-lined robes to retain warmth. This was not viewed as shameful, it was routine. Digestives, food as cure food, could heal as well as harm. Post-feast, the monarch might be served wafers with caraway seeds, wine steeped with coriander, bread with crushed cloves, a slice of quince jelly, considered firming to the gut in Islamic medicine. Digestive tonics, called marjan, were made with dates, licorice, and cardamom. Persian and Moorish courts prized these as post-feast miracles. Some queens preferred herbal teas made from lemon balm, sage, chamomile, lavender, served warm in small cups just before retiring to bed. And then they waited, the toilet and the aftermath, the morning after a royal feast. The groom of the stool or equivalent attendant paid close attention. Was the stool normal? Loose, firm, greenish? These details were whispered discreetly to the court. Physician, adjustments were made. A lighter meal was prescribed for the evening, or perhaps nothing at all. In some cases, the king would call for quiet, no meetings, no councils, just digestion, recovery, because royal bellyaches, when mishandled, led to misjudgments. More than one treaty was delayed due to a sour stomach. One war was supposedly launched a week early because a monarch, sleepless and bloated, demanded swift action at dawn. Digestion, in a way, shaped history. Let's pause again. The banquet is a memory now. The belly is quieting. A page delivers mint. Tea. The king finally leans back in his chair, exhaling, and somewhere in the kitchen below, the next feast is already being planned, because the rhythm never ends. Etiquette, oddities, and the hidden language of royal dining, *, morning after the feast. The hall has been cleared. The fire has burned down to embers. The linens have been soaked, scrubbed, and hung. Yet in the silence that follows the banquet, the echoes remain of laughter, coughing, murmured gossip, clinking knives, and soft groans. And beyond the food and discomfort, something deeper lingers, because feasting in royal courts was more than indulgence. It was a coded system of etiquette, status, and expression. A way to speak without words, to elevate or diminish with a bite. Tonight, or rather this morning, we pull back the final curtain. We explore the unwritten rules, the symbolic foods, and the peculiar customs that made medieval royal dining far more than just a meal. Let us step carefully back into the hall. Where you sat meant everything in a royal feast. Your place at the table was not random, it was destiny. The closer you sat to the monarch, the higher your status. To be seated directly across from the king or queen was a sign of particular favor or scrutiny. Farther down the table meant lesser rank. If you sat at a side table, you were important, but not essential. And if you stood, you were part of the court, but not yet of it. Some banquets had hundreds of guests, arranged in tiers, dais king, queen heir, highest nobles, upper hall barons, bishops, court officers, lower hall knights, clerks, emissaries, servants, trench attendants, guards, jesters. Even the serving order followed hierarchy. The best cuts of meat, the freshest bread, the clearest wine, they moved from top to bottom. You knew who mattered by what they chewed. The language of the knife-royal dining was an orchestrated ballet, each movement by diners and servers alike was loaded with meaning. A knight who carved meat for the queen demonstrated loyalty. A bishop who passed a goblet to the king without looking down showed humility. Pages trained for years to walk, pour, and serve without misstep. And then there was the carver. This role, often held by a noble youth or favoured squire, was sacred. He unfolded the napkin over his arm. He chose the proper knife meat, fish, fowl. He made incisions with precision, no tearing, no waste. He presented the slice on the blade for the monarch to lift. One wrong cut could ruin a reputation. One perfect slice, a pathway to knighthood. The foods that spoke certain foods carried symbolic weight. Pomegranates symbolized fertility. Served at weddings, fish, especially eel, represented wisdom, popular during Lent feasts. Quail was associated with lust, served sparingly, sometimes avoided. Eggs were humble and sacred, linked to resurrection. Boar's head, triumph served after a military victory. Peacock, immortality reserved for coronations. One of the most curious customs, the subtlety. This was a dish not meant to be eaten, but sign-crafted in sugar, marzipan, or bread dough. A castle with tiny sugar guards. A saint's shrine, complete with candied relics. A swan with golden beak wings, outstretched, singing via bellows hidden in its base. These were stories told in food. Propaganda, sometimes. Celebration, always. Manners, do's and don'ts medieval. Table manners were complex, precise, and strictly observed in royal settings. Expected behavior. Wash hands before and after. Don't wipe fingers on the tablecloth, use personal. Napkin, tear bread with fingers, not teeth. Speak softly if at all during the king's first course. Do not reach, wait to be offered. Keep elbows off the table unless injured. Offer the best cut to someone of higher status even. If it's yours, absolute taboos, spitting, blowing one's nose, belching audibly, dropping food on the floor, laughing loudly while chewing. Violating these rules could lead to exclusion, or whispers, or worsen, entry in the steward's book. Even kings had expectations. A monarch who ate too fast or too sloppily risked losing moral authority. The people expected majesty, not gluttony. Curious dishes and forgotten flavors, some dishes boggle the modern mind. A few examples: blank manga, a white pudding of almond milk, chicken, rice, and sugar. Lamprey pie, sea serpent-like fish, baked with spices. Hedgehog stew, real or sculpted from pork, studded with almond spines. Glazed eels, coiled in rings, lacquered with honey. Jellied meats, set in aspic and molded into animal shapes. Even ice cream had a predecessor: frozen milk stirred in snow, flavored with violets or saffron, served in tiny silver bowls in Italian and Moorish courts in Tudor England. Marchpanan, early marzipan, was rolled, sculpted and painted like cake fondant, often too pretty to eat, and sometimes it wasn't eaten at all. It simply existed, like a crown made edible. Never consumed. The role of scent and sound feasting was not only visual and gustatory, it engaged all senses. Scent was controlled carefully. Rosewater sprinkled on linens. Lavender tucked into napkin folds. Censers burned herbs beneath tables. Sound mattered too. Minstrels played quietly in the background. Birdsong might be mimicked on flutes. Silver bells signaled the start and end of each course. Excessive laughter was frowned upon. So was silence too deep. A gentle murmur was ideally a human hum beneath the music. The invisible workers for every guest. There were 3 workers behind the scenes: scullions to wash dishes, turnspits to rotate meat day and night, pantrymen to manage bread, and cloth butlers to manage wine, often with hidden keys. Sewer, not waste, but from assiette to seat, supervised serving order. And the taster. Every royal meal was sampled first by a trusted attendant, sometimes a nobleman. This was not mere ceremony. Poison was a real fear. Tasters risked illness or worst to preserve the monarch's safety, and they did it quietly, daily, without applause. The leftovers, food as diplomacy and alms-nothing, went to waste. After the feast, high-quality leftovers were boxed and sent to favored nobles. Lesser remnants were distributed to monastic kitchens. Bread trenchers went to poor at the gate. Dogs received bones. Servants might receive pies and pastries as reward. This redistribution was intentional. It reminded everyone that the king's table, though divine, fed the kingdom. Food was policy. A meal, a message, final reflections. The feast as mirror what did a royal banquet reveal. Everything it told you: who was in power, who was out of favor, who sat next to whom, who laughed, who didn't eat. It told you what the kingdom could afford, what its cooks could imagine, what its people could dream, and behind it all, slowly, sipping cautiously, knowing every bite was seen. The feast ended not with the last dish, but with the final breath of the day, and the silence that followed. Closing the hall, now the king has risen, the queen has smiled once more, the minstrels bow, the curtains are drawn, the grease is wiped from the goblets, and the feast fades to memory. The belly may ache, the mouth may still taste clove and wine, but the table is quiet until the next celebration, until the next roast swan, until the next story. Let's now wander into a different time, a different place. A new tale stirs just beyond the shadows of the throne.